Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second part of our speed reading and memory techniques workshop organized by the CFA Sri Lanka Society. We had a good session on Tuesday on speed reading, and I'm sure those of you who participated in that would have enjoyed it. And today we are going to go into memory techniques. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time, let me first start by introducing our trainer to you. Paul Novak is the founder and CEO of IRIS, the largest and most trusted provider of speed reading and memory training. He has been a guest speaker at universities that include Harvard, Stanford, Berkeley, and NUS. His programs have been taught to over 1 million students, executives, and lifelong learners, including at companies such as NASA, Google, Fidelity, and many Fortune 500 companies. Thanks, Paul, for joining us. Paul is joining us from Chicago. Paul, over to you.
Good morning and good evening to many of you. Thanks for having me. We had a really productive session last time, and I think you'll find today's workshop helpful, especially if you're doing a lot of not only reading, but situations where you have to memorize information. And we've done this with I think it's around 50 CFA organizations. I mentioned that last time, but I'm mentioning it because, sure, this is helpful information when you're a working professional and you have a lot of reading to do and you have to memorize information. For me, I do a lot of memorization that has to be sometimes presented. So I read some information, and now later on, maybe a few days later or a week later, I have to actually present on the information. And of course, the reading is just done to get the background to make sure. Today is going to be focused heavily on memory. We will talk a little bit about something we didn't really cover in the last session, because the last session we talked about reading faster, improving comprehension, but we didn't talk much about note-taking. So we will talk about note-taking today, but most of the focus is going to be on memory techniques. And a lot of these techniques, I learned them after I got out of college, and I wish I learned them when I was, taking classes at my university, because that would have helped me tremendously. But I want all of you to know that it's better late than never. So here's what we're going to cover. First of all, I want to talk about note-taking. And one of the common questions I get is, what's better, taking notes by hand or highlighting or maybe digital notes? There is some strong evidence to suggest that taking notes by hand is more effective, is better for your memory than digital notes, and also better than highlighting. Have you ever had this? Maybe, I don't know about you, but when I was in college, you would sometimes buy a used college textbook, because textbooks can be very expensive. And so you buy a used one, but then you ever notice this? You have ridiculous amounts of highlighting, maybe that the previous person did, or maybe you've been guilty of this right here, highlighting like crazy. There is a balance that we want to strike between highlighting too much or too little. Same thing with notes. You can take notes and that benefits your memory, but if you spend too much time taking notes, it will take too long to get through your chapter. And the same problem is the reverse. If you read something and you don't take any notes at all, you're less likely to remember the important information. So taking notes is definitely beneficial, but taking notes by hand has a little bit more of an effect on your ability to remember than digital notes or highlighting. Now, there's other benefits to taking notes. Most of my notes actually are digital notes, even though I know if I need to remember something very, very well, I'll take notes by hand, and then I'll maybe take a snapshot of it, and then I'll save it in my favorite note-taking program. I like to use Evernote. Some of you may have heard of Evernote. If you go to evernote.com, there's a free version that has a lot of space that you can download. There's other note-taking programs out there. Microsoft has their OneNote. Obviously, you can take notes in just something like Microsoft Word or Google Docs, things like that. But there is some benefit to taking notes by hand. Here's how you avoid excessive highlighting or excessive note taking. So most people, what they do is, they're reading something. Let's say they're just underlining with a pen, or maybe it's a highlighter. They read something and they're like, oh, that's very interesting. Let me highlight or underline that. Then they read the next sentence, and that's kind of important too. So they're going to highlight or underline that as well. And now they read the third sentence, and it turns out this sentence is way more important than the previous two. Maybe I'll use a different color, or you see where I'm going here. If you get caught up in the details, you lose sight of that big picture. So if you are guilty of excessive highlighting or excessive note taking, I would say at the very least, wait until you finish a paragraph. So read a whole paragraph and then take a note. Or what I like to do, if you see over here this little screenshot of a textbook chapter, I would wait until I finish this entire section. So you see the new heading here. I would not take any notes until I get to that new section of text. So I just wanted to make a little bit of commentary on note taking because it goes hand in hand with reading. We all know that sometimes you're reading something and sometimes you're not taking notes. When I'm reading the news, for example, I don't care to take any notes because it's just news. I want to know what's going on in the world, but I'm not taking notes because I'm not going to be tested on this. I don't need to have mastery of the topic. But when I'm reading something for work, or if I was a college student, then I would definitely be taking notes. So mind mapping is another way to organize your information. So if you're not already familiar with mind mapping, this is just a way to visually organize information where you have, this could be the title of your chapter. Actually, what you see on your screen here is a mind map on how to create a mind map, but it's basically you have your main point and then you have your subtopics surrounding it. Mind maps can be done obviously by hand. There is a free program that I use. I'd like to recommend to you guys if you're interested. If you go to xmind.net, let me just show you what it looks like. Xmind is a free mind mapping program. I believe this is a Japanese company that created this. There's one other program I would recommend, and that is MindMeister. They also have a nice little mind mapping program. This one is more fully featured. Just so you know, if you're looking for something free that is downloadable and it works on a Mac or PC, you go to Xmind. And if you want something that is in the cloud, MindMeister is a good one. Although this one also exists in the cloud. I don't want to recommend one or the other. I will show you Xmind right now because this is a nice little tool for organizing your information. So, for example, let's say you're reading a book like we're going to discuss this one right here. This book, Brain Rules, today. You see how it says 12 principles for surviving and thriving at work, home, and school. And then, of course, it's like a 300-page book. But if you were taking notes on this, you might have brain rules in the middle. And then you have, chapter 1, exercise. Chapter 2, survival. Chapter 3, wiring. And so now when you get to chapter 1, you start taking your notes here. Maybe these are your 5 most important points. And maybe each point has some details associated with it. And so on and so forth. As you can see, you can start, this will just allow you to lay things out. And this is one way to do a mind map. Another way to do it, just so you know, because I'm bringing this up from the standpoint of, let's say you're taking notes and you read chapter 1 and you have all these notes. And sometimes your subtopics of subtopics have subtopics. So sometimes you have very, very comprehensive notes. You could zoom in, zoom out. I like this program. You could eventually just export this as a JPEG or a PowerPoint, or maybe you want to print this all to one single page. But I like this program because it also gives me the flexibility of, I don't have to do it like this. I could sometimes when I'm planning a presentation or if I'm doing any kind of writing, I'll have the topic in the middle, and sometimes I don't know where I want to start. Like here, it's very sequential. You see chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. By the way, if this was chapter 4, we just add chapter 4 here. This is attention. Chapter 5 in this book was, let me think here, short-term. Chapter 6 was long-term memory. By the way, we're going to get into this in a few moments here. Got to add a dash here if I'm going to be consistent. By the way, there are 12 chapters in this particular book. So 7 is sleep. 8 is stress. 9 is something called sensory integration. I want you to know, you see the notes I'm taking here? I'm going to show you how to memorize these chapters. So for example, you see how I'm adding this. You could also move things around if you feel like, oh, I want to make this a little more symmetrical. So 11 is, what is 11? Gender, I believe. And 12 is exploration. Okay, let's see if I got those right. Here are the chapter titles for, by the way, let's say you don't want to see all this. You just hit the minus sign here. I don't know if you can see it. If I zoom in, maybe you can. Hit the minus sign, and now we can just see all the topics. And of course, I can make this a little more symmetrical so it looks nicer. But in a few moments, I'm going to show you in this book. Let's say you read through this book or you inspected it. When I say inspect, I mean, maybe just getting the general idea of what the book is about. And then you find out, okay, here's the table of contents. You see right here, 12 chapters. Let's say you read this book, which is 300 pages. By the way, this is not a book by me. This is just some guy, John Medina. I've never met him, but he wrote this nice book about brain rules. It's pretty interesting. And this is just an example for what if you had to memorize, what if you read this book and now you need to deliver a presentation about what you've just read. And you need to talk about, okay, they start the book about exercise and then survival and so forth. So you probably noticed that while I was doing this, I had a little mind map over here. And I was just doing this off the top of my head. And sure, I've given a lot of presentations and sometimes I use this example and other times I don't. But what if you had to memorize this one by one? Like for example, I can cover all of this information and be able to recall it perfectly, but it's only because I've used a little memory technique that helps me do that. So there are ways you can actually memorize information. I want to go over that, and this is without having to just do extreme amounts of repetition. So that's part of what we're going to cover today. So let me get into the slides here. And repetition, we all know repetition is very, very important to helping you memorize information. But this is not the only thing that impacts your memory. So I want to go beyond repetition, because one thing I can do is say, hey, if you want to memorize all of this, I want you to write this down 1,000 times. And that's repetition, right? You would remember and memorize all 12 of these if you wrote it down 1,000 times. But that would take a long time. Your hand would end up hurting eventually. And there are better ways to do it. So besides repetition, let's think about what influences our memory. And there are a number of things that do. So one thing is something that memory researchers call visualization. And visualization is just your brain's ability to visualize information. So that would be something like, if I asked you right now to visualize a cup of coffee or a cup of tea, you might, like I've got some coffee over here, this Chicago mug. So I might visualize something like this for a cup of coffee. Or you might picture a teacup if you're thinking of like some tea in a smaller cup, or you can visualize that in your head. If you can take that ability and apply it to information, then that opens up some possibilities. And we're going to talk about that today. Think about when you forget a name. Now at the beginning, Deshaun was nice enough to introduce me, and he mentioned my name. Some of you may have forgotten my name. That's fine. My name's Paul, by the way, but we all forget names. Sometimes it happens. Sometimes this can be very frustrating. Like if you have a situation like this here, you meet someone and you immediately forget their name and you're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I just forgot their name. They just told it to me. And this is sometimes not so much a problem with, this is not always a problem with memory. Sometimes this is a problem with maybe paying attention. Sometimes we don't pay attention while they're telling us their name, and that's why we forget it. We didn't really forget it, we just never received it to begin with. But isn't it true that you are more likely to remember a person's face than their name? Like, for example, I'm on a webcam right now, so you can see how I look. Let's say we met in person. We would remember each other by face more easily than by name. Why? Because names are abstract. They're just a grouping of letters, and that's a name. But visual information is always easier to remember than a face. Your visual recall, as you can see here on the slide, is better than your verbal recall. And this is why companies will have, not only the name of their company, but they'll also have some sort of a logo or other visual representations of what they do. Like, I'm thinking McDonald's, they also have I don't know, they had this weird clown for years. They still kind of use the clown, but it's a Ronald McDonald, this clown associated with McDonald's. Lots of companies have this kind of thing. Now, another thing I'd like to discuss is related to your short-term and long-term memory. So on the screen right now, you see 11 digits. Most people would see this, and if I ask them to, okay, tell me what the 11 digits are, it would be like, I don't know. Let me see it again. Here you go. But you can study this, and you can try to memorize it, but what about, first of all, most people will not remember it. If they just spent a few seconds on the slide, like we just did here, most people would not be able to remember all 11 digits. Here they are again. But this relates to something called Miller's magic number. And this is named, Miller refers just to this cognitive psychologist out of Princeton University. So he was also a professor there. And George Miller, in 1952, he wrote a paper called The Magic Number 7 Plus or Minus 2. And it had to do with short-term memory. You see the graphical representation of this on the screen. And all it had to do with is the fact that most people could remember about 7 things, and then the memory goes off a cliff. It just, as you can see here, it just drops. So think about it like this. If you were going to the grocery store, let's say later today you had to go and you had to get some juice, you've got to get some bread, you've got to get a bunch of different items. There's a certain point where you would say, if you were just getting 2 things, let's say, I don't know, bread and tomatoes, you don't need a list, right? But if you were saying, okay, I got to get bread, I got to get tomatoes, I got to get this and that, and you keep going, there's a certain point where you would say, you know what, I really need to make a list or I'm going to forget. And for most people, after 4, 5, or 6 items, they would make a list. And it has to do with this Miller's magic number. This is just somebody that coined this term, but it basically means that you could remember about 7 things, plus or minus 2, because it depends on what we're trying to remember. Some people can remember more than others, but it all comes down to, we have this limit on our short-term memory. You can only remember so much short-term. But here's the weird thing, remember the 11 digits here? That's just 11 digits. Do you remember more than 11 things? In your mind, you have thousands. You can argue that you have millions of things that you've remembered. You've got to remember the names of your family members, your friends. You've got to remember coworkers, not just names. You have all this information in your head, lots and lots of data. But yet somehow we can't remember someone's name, or we can't remember 11 digits short term. It's because there is a distinction between short term and long term. So we all know that with memory, the hard part is, maybe not the hard part, but the challenge is, how do I take this short-term memory and convert it into long-term memory? There's got to be a conversion process, right? So Here's that number again. If I gave you this number, isn't this bottom number easier to remember than the top number? If you haven't noticed, they're the same numbers. They're just represented differently, right? At the bottom, we have dashes, and on the top, we have just numbers. And by the way, this is my phone number, my office number. Please don't call right now, otherwise I'll be distracted. Turn my phone here off. This is phone numbers are easier to remember. Why? Think about how your brain looks at this information on the bottom versus this one. All of us would agree this is much easier. We have a country code here for the US. This 312 is, if you're familiar with like area codes in the US, 312 is a Chicago area code. And then we have 970-1232. Now, you could memorize this more easily on the bottom because it's broken up into parts. Chunking is a way to improve your memory. Let me explain what I mean by chunking. Chunking is, for example, let's say you had to go to the grocery store and get 9 items. 9. You could make a list. And I mean, that's what I usually do. If I have to go to a store, I usually make a list. But what if those 9 items were in 3 areas of the grocery store? Maybe one area was in the bakery area, another was in maybe the frozen section, and the other area might be the deli. Now, when I get to the deli, if I had to get, I don't know, ham, chicken, and let's say pork, when I get to the deli, I'll remember that. When I go to the frozen section, if I have to get 3 different frozen items, I'll remember that. If I go to the bakery section, then maybe I'll remember, oh, I need to get a X, Y, and Z when I get to the bakery section. So you might study a list of 9 items, and by themselves, those 9 items might be difficult to memorize by themselves. But if you look over the list a few times and then you memorize instead a chunked 3 section, okay, I just have to remember the frozen, bakery, and deli. When you get to those areas, you start to recall. So this is what we mean by chunking information. That can be useful. That's also why mind maps are useful. So mind maps start to chunk information. Let me just go back a little bit. You see how this information gets chunked into parts? That's why mind maps can be effective. Also, mind maps are a little, in a certain way, mind maps are very visual. We talked about visual information. So this is a way to visually organize your information. Now, if you look at this word right here, now, I mentioned in the last webinar that English is not my first language. My first language is Polish. Both of my parents are immigrants from Poland. They came to the US a number of years ago. I was born in the US, in Chicago, but I did not speak English until I was like 5 or 6 years old. But when I was learning the word Wednesday, you kind of automatically chunk information sometimes. Like for a lot of people, even native English speakers, Wednesday would be Wednesday. It's not pronounced that way, but it's just how it is. Wednesday. Wednesday. Okay. So chunking is a good way to remember information, but it's not the only thing. We know mnemonics help. So some of you are already familiar with mnemonic devices. We're not going to go too deeply into this because a lot of you have probably been exposed to mnemonics at some point, maybe during your academic career. But mnemonics are some examples if you're not already familiar. The order of operations. I remember when I was younger, they had this way to remember. If you had to calculate some long equation, you would use this acronym here. You see PEMDAS, P-E-M-D-A-S. Or sometimes I remember learning it as, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. Or some people learn it as just PEMDAS. But that just means parentheses, exponents, and then you do multiplication, division, addition, subtraction, and so on. There are all sorts of different mnemonics. Like what you see here is if you ever get confused about how many days are in a month, like June, are there 30 or 31? You can just use your knuckles to figure it out right here. So when you have a knuckle, it's 31 days. When you have a valley, you see knuckle and knuckle over here. Those are 31. Anything in between, the gaps between your knuckles is 28 or 30, and so on. So there are all different types of mnemonic devices. One thing I would suggest, if you're ever learning something that is a common thing to learn, for example, my wife, she works as a nurse. And when she was in nursing school, she did this all the time. When she had to remember something like, let's say, the systems of the body, something related to anatomy, she would type systems of the body, mnemonic. And Google would inevitably find some videos. The first few results would show like a blog post, how to memorize the systems of the body, some sort of mnemonic device. So that's a good way to do it. You could also use a mnemonic generator. There's a really interesting website, and this is a free to use tool, mnemonicgenerator.com. You just type in what you need to remember, and then you hit generate, and it generates a mnemonic device for you. It's actually kind of interesting. If you, let's say you have to remember the planets. You see right here, all the planets in the solar system. We click generate, and we get this silly mnemonic device here. Just each letter at the beginning represents one of the planets. So minotaurs victimized elephants. Okay. Meanwhile, jewels squeezed unicycles noisily. Okay, that's weird. By the way, if you don't like that mnemonic device, that sentence, you could hit generate again, and it'll give you a new one. You see here, Medusa vanquished Eskimos. Meanwhile, joggers saluted Ultraman noisily. You'll notice this is a little weird, right? And the thing about using mnemonics is that if you have something that's weird, you're more likely to remember it. So here's another example. If you had to remember these things right here in a certain order. Now, these might not come to you immediately, but you hit generate and you get something else. You know, offensive owls observed tasty trash adorably for Velma, graded voluptuous apricots heroically. Very strange, right? Or you hit it again and you get something else. Organic otters and so on. I just want to bring this up because there are all sorts of different types of mnemonic devices. Mnemonics help, chunking helps, but what else? We said visualization, right? Remember that phone number, 312 could remind you of Chicago. And this is our tallest building in Chicago. They call it the Sears Tower. But let's talk about how we remember other things and the science behind why we actually forget information. So think about this. How fast do you forget? You get some information. How long does it take before that information is gone from your short-term memory? Well, here is the forgetting curve. You see right here at the beginning, when you first learn information, the exponential decay happens very quickly until you review. So when you get some repetition, we all know repetition helps us remember. So when you review, it's kind of like bringing that memory back to 100% temporarily, because we're still going to forget information. No one's perfect. It'd be nice if we had like a hard drive type functionality in our brain where we could just retrieve information, but we start forgetting. And then we remember information and we review it, right? Notice how the more you review, you see these lines, they're getting less steep. The curve starts off very, very steep. And then you remember and it's less steep. You review it again, less steep. The more you review, eventually this is going to become a horizontal line where it's just in your long-term memory. But when exactly should we review? Notice how initially you should review very quickly. And then you could leave some time and review a little later, and so on. This reminds me of something called the Fibonacci sequence. This is if you want to think of it as like a mathematical approach to remembering information. So let's bring this back to reading. You read some information. You read chapter 5 here, or the entire book. Now you need to review, because aren't there some books that you've read that you can't remember what they were about? I'm sure there are. There are books I've read when I was in school, like in high school, and I can't remember what they were about. But I can tell you if I liked them or didn't, but I can't remember the plot, the details. So this Fibonacci sequence is a good way to think about when you should review. So notice the spaces here, very, very short period of time. Here, a little longer, and so on. So in the Fibonacci sequence, if you haven't already picked up on the pattern, and I know some of you are already familiar with this, but it's, okay, you take the two numbers, 1 and 1, and the sum, when you add 1 and 1, you get 2. 1 plus 2 equals 3, 2 plus 3 equals 5, 5 plus 8 equals 13, and so on and so forth. That's the Fibonacci sequence. But you'll notice as you do this sequence, the gaps between the numbers are getting wider and wider. At first, as you can see here, they start off and they're very, very small gaps, but then they get much, much wider as we continue the sequence, exponentially wider. So we can actually look at how we study. And I say study, I know most of you are probably not in school, but when we think about studying in terms of remembering information, I read this book or I read this PDF, this research report, whatever it is, and I need to remember it very, very well. When should I actually review the information? Well, let's say you learned the information at 12 p.m. You see the Fibonacci numbers are on the top here. When you should review on the bottom. You don't have to go exactly in this manner, but if you want to kind of mimic the Fibonacci sequence as to when you review, first review, let's say you finish reading something and you're done at 12 p.m. Okay, put your book away, work on something else. Or I say put your book away, maybe put your PDF away, you work on something else, but you set maybe an alarm on your phone, and now you're saying, okay, at 1 p.m., an hour later, 1 hour later, I'm going to review that information. Those notes that I took, I'm going to review it. Okay. 1 hour later comes by and you review. And by the way, those reviews are very quick. So I might spend 5 minutes reviewing my notes. It might take me 1 minute reviewing my notes. Now, when should I review that information again? If I really need to remember it very well, we utilize the Fibonacci sequence. And if I reviewed it at 1 p.m., I'm now reviewing again at 2 p.m. I'm sorry, 3 p.m. 2 hours later at 3 p.m. And then 3 hours later at 6 p.m. And then 5 hours later at 11 p.m. And then, of course, thank goodness we do need to sleep. So 8 hours later at 7 a.m. Now, these numbers don't have to be precise. I'm not suggesting you wake up, if these starting numbers were different, I'm not suggesting you wake up at 2 in the morning or 3 in the morning to review your information. But the idea is you need a lot of repetition at the beginning when you first get the information. You need to review it quickly, as you see here. 1 hour later, 2 hours later, 3 hours later. But then you can start spacing it out more. 5 hours later, 8 hours later. What would be the next one? 5 plus 8 equals 13. So then we wouldn't review again. If we reviewed at 7 in the morning, we wouldn't review again until 8 p.m. Now, it also helps if you review your information a little bit before you go to bed. I'm not talking about when you're very, very tired. Just a little bit before you go to bed, before you get really, really tired. If you had to remember something very, very well for the next day, it's a good idea to review your notes or study, a little bit in the evening, or review your information in the evening. Because sleeping also has an effect on your memory. If you don't get enough sleep, then it will affect your ability to remember information. Actually, sleeping helps organize information and improves your memory just overall. And then, of course, first thing in the morning. But you can think of this as like a Fibonacci study plan. By the way, you could also do this minute by minute. If you had to, let's say you were learning a new language, and you've got to remember, I don't know, let's say you're trying to accumulate 30 new words every single day. Okay, so we got our 30 words. We review them. And then 1 minute later, notice how here it was based on hours, right? The timeline. You could also do it based on minutes. So we review our 30-word list 1 minute later. That's repetition number 1. Repetition number 2, we do it 1 minute later again. You see right here, these are all Fibonacci numbers. 1 plus 1 equals 2. 1 plus 2 equals 3. So you do 1 minute later, 2 minutes later, 3 minutes later, 5 minutes later, 8 minutes, and so on and so forth. And this is another way you can implement it. But if you had to do this, you might set alarms. Now, this is very, very repetitive, but maybe you need to review your information very quickly because you just got the information. You're learning 30 brand new words, or maybe you're doing conjugation of verbs, or again, it's just using Fibonacci numbers, this kind of mathematical approach to reviewing information, because it comes down to when should we review. Initially, very quickly. Later, you still need to review, but you can space out the gaps wider and wider, and that's what a Fibonacci sequence is all about. So this also has to do with, within memory research, they sometimes call this spaced repetition. That's like the fancy word for it. They also call it retrieval practice. Retrieval practice is just the practice of retrieving information, better known as testing yourself, quizzing yourself. Now in school, we get quizzes and tests and things like that. But if you're trying to learn new information, if you're reading something, retrieval practice is you actually thinking to yourself, okay, what did I just read? Do I remember the details? Or maybe in brain rules, we had 12 chapters to remember. There is one other thing I want to mention, and that has to do with association. How you remember information is related to how you associate information. And this is a learning principle, association. It reminds me of this Baker-Baker effect, which is a really cool, interesting psychology study that they've replicated many, many times. But let me give you just a quick summary of what it's about, because it's related to association. Here's how the Baker-Baker effect works. They take people, a group of people, they have group A and group B. And their group A is introduced to some guy named Mr. Baker. Now, the point of the study is they want to see how many people are going to remember his name. How many people will remember that this guy is Mr. Baker? Now, because that's the point of the study, they do not tell the people in the study that that's the point. They tell the people in the study the point of the study is something else. And the reason why is if you told everyone that the goal is to remember his name, everyone would place more emphasis on it. It would skew the results. So we don't want to skew the results. We just introduced some guy named Mr. Baker halfway through the study. Everyone thinks the study is about something else. Psychologists, they're like basically lying to all these people. So later on, they bring the people back and they're asked, do you remember anything about this person? Do you remember his name? Most people forget the name. It's usually more than 90% of people forget Mr. Baker's name. Now, that is not surprising because we all know that we've all forgotten names before, and we didn't know this was an important person. We didn't know that was the point of the study. So most people would forget Mr. Baker's name. Now, here's the interesting thing. The second group, Group B, is introduced to the same exact guy, but they're told that he is a baker. Not Mr. Baker. They're told he's a baker. His occupation is baking goods. Interesting thing about this group, when they're asked later, what do you remember about this person? Usually, it's the exact opposite of the first group. More than 90% of people end up remembering that he was a baker. Even though they didn't know that they had to remember that, the fact that they were told he's a baker, his occupation, they're just more likely to remember that because, and this is what they call the Baker-Baker effect. You have, in one case, Mr. Baker, hard to remember. In another case, you have a baker, and that's easy to remember. Why is it easy to remember? It's because aren't there a lot of associations to a baker, right? Like, how do you picture a baker? What do you visualize? What do you associate? Remember I said association is very important? You have associations related, already embedded in your brain to a baker. You might picture a little top hat like this. You might picture cakes or bread or some other baked item. But the same thing goes for other occupations, right? Like if I told you doctor, you can visualize in your head how a doctor might look. I don't know. Some people might visualize like a white, laboratory type coat, right, that a doctor might wear. Same thing goes if I said construction worker, right? You might picture a tool belt. A construction worker looks different than a doctor, right? So this Baker-Baker effect is really interesting, and it has everything to do with association and visualization in your head. So what else influences your memory? There's one other thing, and that is the fact that you remember things that are weird. This is a kind of strange visual, but McDonald's used Ronald McDonald. I guess they still use him sometimes. Ronald McDonald is a visual of McDonald's, and it's weird. It's a clown, especially after this movie. I don't know if you've seen it. The movie It, based on the Stephen King novel, this horror film related to clowns. I think when this movie came out, I think McDonald's stopped using the clown. They didn't stop, but they used it less often because all of a sudden the association to clowns for some people are scared of clowns. We're not scared of clowns, but Ronald McDonald is a weird visual. But notice this. Isn't it true when you watch commercials on TV? You ever see commercials that are just ridiculous or weird? It's actually very common. Like here in the US, we have this insurance company, Geico. And Geico, their visual is when they do commercials, they have this talking gecko. It's like a little lizard that talks in a British accent. I think it's a British accent. But it's a weird visual. Why do they do that? Why not just tell people, hey, we have car insurance and maybe you'll save some money. Give us a call. Instead, they do this weird visual with a talking gecko. A lot of times the commercials are kind of funny, but it's not just Geico. It's not just McDonald's. It's not all companies. A lot of companies will do this because they know if you do something that's weird or exaggerated, the consumer is more likely to remember that information. So you see this right here? You have a, if you look at this, and the longer you look at these letters, eventually you'll see some sort of a pattern, I would imagine. Can you remember the 14 letters? If you see a pattern, you might notice like you see the pattern right here, right? The acronyms. Now remember Miller's magic number? George Miller, that Princeton University professor that I told you about, he said we could remember about 14 things. We can remember about 14, not 14. He said we could remember about 7 things. But you could remember these 14 if you chunk the information. You see here, it's chunked into parts. Or if you chunk it into parts, you see the top part is the same as the bottom. Notice X's on the beginning and ends. It's a pattern. By the way, as human beings, we like looking for patterns. Even when there are no patterns available at all, we'll find patterns. Reminds me of a really good book by Nassim Taleb called Fooled by Randomness. This is one of the first books I read related to finance when I was in high school. It was recommended when I was working at the Chicago Board of Trade. Fooled by Randomness, how we find patterns sometimes in random information. Anyway, so we have this stuff at the bottom. What if I asked you to visualize this information? Let's do a quick little exercise here. I want you to think of, you see PhD here? I want you to think of, there's a man that has a PhD. Okay, picture him sitting in his office. He's got a PhD like on the wall, framed. And this person also works for the CIA. Okay, so just picture, he's a spy. He works for the CIA. He's got a PhD. And he also has a UFO. He gets to fly around in a UFO across the USA, across the entire US. East Coast to West Coast, he just kind of flies around to do his spy missions. So guy with a PhD, works for the CIA, has a UFO, flying around a UFO all across the USA. Now, what about these X's? You see these bookends? Think of the X's sort of like bookends to this totally made up story. Now, this story makes 0 sense. How would a guy with a PhD that works for the CIA have a UFO flying around? It's a silly story, right? But if I asked you to recall it right now, I think you'd be able to recall it. Feel free to type it in the chat box right now if you can recall off the top of your head. But you think about, how do you recall it? You recall it based on the story, right? You're thinking, okay, I know there were X's at the beginning and end. There's a guy with a PhD, right? He works for the CIA, and he's got a UFO, and he's flying across the US in this UFO. So I see a lot of you, a number of you are heading in the chat box. You can remember it, right? So wouldn't it be weird? Remember I showed you these numbers, or not numbers, but these letters earlier. What if you had to remember this just one by one? Isn't it harder to remember it one by one? it's easier when you remember it like this, right? Because now you've chunked the information into parts, even if the story makes no sense, and it doesn't make any sense. By the way, this is totally useless information. I just got you to memorize something that is not useful in any way for school, for your career, or the work you do, but you memorize 14 letters. Hey, whatever happened to George Miller? Where was he on the slides? Remember George Miller said we could remember about 7 things short term? Well, first of all, George Miller published this study, his research, in 1952. It was a long time ago. We know a lot more about memory in the brain since 1952. But George Miller was generally correct that we could remember about 7 things short term on first exposure. By the way, his paper was the magic number 7 plus or minus 2, because again, it's not exactly 7. Depends on the person, depends on the information. But you could remember more if you start doing things like this. Chunking. What did we do here? We chunked. We visualized. We created a little story. We associated the information. All of that helped. And also the fact, remember I told you another thing that influences your memory is you're more likely to remember weird or exaggerated things. Or things that are out of the ordinary. For example, I can remember what I was doing on September 11th. I was in high school here in Chicago, and when the news came about in the morning, they evacuated the high school where I was because there were rumors that other planes were heading towards Chicago. It was a very crazy day. I remember a lot of detail about that day. Now, if you take any other experience that is out of the ordinary, it could be maybe a traumatic experience, or some people remember very significant things in their lives, like you might remember a wedding, because that's, hopefully, unless you get married multiple times, hopefully that's like a once in a lifetime kind of thing. But we remember things that are rare or out of the ordinary or exaggerated. So it's something very important to realize. And like I said here, that's what we're doing here. All of these things play a part: chunking, association, repetition, visualization, and things that are out of the ordinary. By the way, if you had to remember these memory principles, you could also create a little mnemonic device from it, right? By taking the first letter of each one and just thinking Carvo. These are all things that influence your memory. So let's talk about how we read and remember. So remember this process. In the last webinar, we talked about inspecting information before you read it. Why do we do that? So we can get familiar with the material. If you did not join us in the last webinar, the whole point here is, all right, let's say I've got this book I'm reading right now, Algorithms to Live By. And the subtitle is The Computer Science of Human Decisions. Pretty good book. I'm about halfway through it. But when I'm reading material, when I get to a new chapter, so for example, let me show you here. Let me flip over to the end here. There's a chapter here, chapter 8. If I was going to read this, what I do is first I read the introduction to the chapter. So I will, right here, I have how many paragraphs? 1, 2, 3, 4. The first 4 paragraphs on the first and second page, and then I get the new section here. I'll read the introduction first, and then I'll read the next heading here, which is the difficulty of optimization. And then I'll flip. The whole point of the inspection is just to get familiar with your material. I'll flip, and I see here defining difficulty. Just relax. By the way, there's a little quote here from Voltaire that I would read. The perfect is the enemy of the good. I would read that. And then I'm just flipping through, and I'm looking at, all right, there's a little diagram here. So I'll just get a first impression of what is that. I'll read the title of that, and then I'll read this title. So I'm going through page by page, and I'm just looking at headings, subheadings. Every so often, this author seems to use like a heading and also a little quote at the beginning. So I'll just flip through. And when I get to the end, I'll read the summary. There's a little summary at the end. That is all part of the inspection phase of the reading process. Once I'm done inspecting, the next step is read the information. So remember, I showed you guys this article in the last webinar. I just showed you a chapter. What if you're reading an actual article that doesn't have headings and subheadings? Well, you just read the first sentence of each paragraph, and then you read the entire article. It'll help you read faster, help you understand it better. But when you're inspecting a chapter, it's introduction, headings, and subheadings. You're reading boldface words, italics, anything popping off the page, basically. And then when you get to the end, you read the conclusion. Then you read. Notice what's going on here. Remember we said repetition's important. You inspect. By the way, after you inspect, you should probably take some notes, and then you read. And then you inquire. And then you figure out how you're going to store the information. Now, what I want you to do right now is try to store this information you see right here. So we'll go over it right here. Let's say you were reading brain rules, and you had to get through this information and understand it very, very well. How do we do it? Well, you have the table of contents, exercise, survival, wiring, attention, short-term memory, long-term memory, sleep, stress, sensory integration, vision, gender, exploration. Now, I'm going to show you a technique for memorizing all of this. But in the meantime, what I want you to do is I'm going to give you a few moments here to actually read the information. I'm only going to give you 6 minutes. So here's how this is going to work. I'm going to set a little timer here. And I've got the brain rules on the screen right now. So here's how it's going to work. I'm going to show you how to memorize this, but right now, I just want you to read this. Do you see on my screen right now? Rule number 1, exercise. Rule number 2, survival. By the way, this document that you see on my screen is, it is actually in the chat box that I sent you earlier. You see right here, it's this link, files.irisreading.com/brainrules.pdf. I will send this in the chat just so it's, I know I sent it earlier, but I'll send it in the chat one more time to everyone, just in case anyone's interested in downloading this. So I'll send this to everyone in the meeting. And you can refer to this as you want. But I'm going to give you, let's do a little faster just because we're somewhat, I don't want to say we're pressed for time, but we don't have unlimited time. I want you to read through all of these brain rules, okay? So you see rule number 1, exercise. By the way, I don't happen to have this book in front of me right now, but here's what these are. These are the summaries of each chapter. So you see chapter 1 is about exercise. If you were going through this book, brain rules, you would notice at the end of every chapter, there is a nice little conclusion. And this is the conclusion to chapter 1. This is the conclusion to chapter 2. Chapter 3, chapter 4, and so on. There's 12 chapters. I want you to read through this whole document. Like I said, the document you can find in the chat box. What I will do is I'll have it on the screen here, and you can basically read it. I'm going to leave each page up for about 1 minute. And then I'm going to switch to the next page and the next page. So you could read off the screen. However, everyone has a different reading speed. So maybe download this. So check in the chat box and you can find those 2 links that I just mentioned. But otherwise, I'm going to temporarily mute my microphone and I will also stop my webcam. I'll be back on in a little bit. Bye-bye. But I just want you to read the summary of each chapter. When would we do this? Let me go back on the webcam here for a moment. Basically, before you read anything, you read the back of the book, and then you look at the table of contents, as we saw here. We already went over it. And then, instead of just starting on page number 1 of chapter 1, what I would suggest you do is you go and you just kind of do this through a book to look for patterns. And if you're doing this through this book right here, Brain Rules, you would notice, and in a lot of nonfiction, you'll notice this, every chapter has a summary. Okay, how am I going to inspect that information? Remember we said inspecting information, like we had in the slides. Inspecting information helps you know the big picture. So you might be starting with a book like Brain Rules, and you're just going to read the summary of each chapter. Also reminds me of this 80-20 principle. You're reading a little bit of information, but you're getting a lot of information. Or you're spending a little bit of time, you're going to spend about 5 minutes here reading summaries. And even though you spend 5 minutes, you get a lot of information in return. So it's a good, if we want to think of like ROI, like return on investment, this is like a good return on investment of time. So I just want you to read the summary of each chapter. I'll have it on my screen, but like I said, check in the chat box. That's where you can find the link to this document and you can read it on your own. I will disable my webcam and we're going to start just 5 minutes of reading. Okay, so go ahead and begin reading. I'll jump back on the microphone in 5 minutes. Go ahead and begin reading all these summaries. Okay, let me stop you guys there. So we've just spent a very short period of time reading the summary of each chapter here. One thing I do want to alert you through here is, all right, this is your first exposure to the text. You haven't read this whole book. This book is about 300 pages. But what I'm trying to emphasize here is if you were going to read this book, the first thing you should do is get a little bit familiar with it. So whenever I have a brand new book, I read the back, I read the table of contents, and then if it's nonfiction, I will just kind of go like this, flipping through, and I pay attention specifically to beginnings and ends of chapters because I'm looking for an introduction or a conclusion. Now, in most nonfiction books, including this one right here, including Brain Rules right here, you'll find conclusions at the end of chapters or introductions at the beginning of every chapter. So if that was the case, I would read the introduction of every chapter or the conclusion of every chapter. So it takes a very short period of time. This might take you 5-6 minutes like we just did here. And then what do? Well, all right, now we're going to actually read this book if you're interested, or maybe you already know about this information. Inspecting material first helps you save time. So you might say, you know what, I'm just going to read chapter 6 and 7 or chapter 5 and 6. Maybe these are the only chapters you're actually interested in, short-term and long-term memory. Or you might be very interested in the topic of sleep. Or maybe you already know enough about sleep and you just read chapters here and there. Or you read the whole book if you're interested in the whole book. But that's the entire point of inspecting information first. Now, once we're done inspecting information, what do? Well, we need to maybe read the book. What if you had to memorize the information? I want to show you how you can memorize all 12 of those chapters in Brain Rules. And by the way, this is a memory technique called the numeric peg system. Very easy to learn. Let's go through it quickly. And I would highly encourage you to make sure while we're doing this, make sure that you're paying attention, because once you learn how this system works, it will help you memorize other things, not just Brain Rules, because we're going to focus on Brain Rules here. But if you know how to memorize using this system, you can memorize presentations. I use this system all the time to memorize things. So here's how the numeric peg system works. Every number turns into a visual. So right now, I need you to visualize the number 1 in your brain. It now needs to become a pencil. Okay? When I tell you 1, you need to think about a pencil. Why? Because they have the same general shape. That's all. Number 1 is a pencil. Number 2 is a swan. Do you see the number 2, like the same kind of shape as a swan? I'm sure you do. It's not perfect, but it's a visual approximation. The number 2 is a swan. Okay? Let's picture that. Number 3 is McDonald's. You got to kind of look at it sideways, but just picture the number 3. When I tell you 3, you need to think of McDonald's. By the way, we're going to have a quiz in a few moments here through the chat box. So please make sure you're paying attention. 1 is a pencil, 2 is a swan, 3 is McDonald's, 4 is a chair. Now it's upside down, but when I tell you 4, I want you to think of a chair. You see the number 4 here, right? Right over here, number 4 is a chair. Number 5 is a hook. I want you to imagine it's upside down. You see the curvy part of the 5 here? You see the curvy part of the hook? When I tell you 5, you need to memorize 5 is a hook. By the way, I promise you this is going to come in handy. I know this is kind of weird when you're like, what are we doing here? Why are we doing 1 is a pencil, 2 is a swan, 3 is a McDonald's, 4 is a chair, 5 is a hook. This is going to help you later. Remember we said visual information is easier to remember? Let's do a quick little test. What is number 1? Type it in the chat box if you can remember. Hopefully you remember 1 is your pencil. Okay, I see a lot of people typing, so good. Number 2, what is number 2? All right, very good. Number 2 is a swan. How about number 3? What is number 3? Number 3 is McDonald's, correct. And number 4, we just did number 4. Very good. I see a lot of people typing chair. By the way, thank you all for participating in the chat. That makes this a little more interactive. Otherwise, I could be just yelling at my computer screen and not knowing if I'm even on mute. Number 5, what is number 5? All right, hook. All right, so you guys got that. What about, we're only going to memorize 10 things, by the way. So we just have 5 more. Number 6, I need you to visualize the number 6 is our cherry. It's not a perfect visualization, but if we were drawing a cherry, you see how it has the same visual, same, like if we were tracing it. Number 6 is a cherry. Number 7 is a lightning bolt. Okay. 7. By the way, do you see there's multiple 7s here? There's a 7 right there. There's also a 7 right here. There's a 7 right here. Picture 7 is a lightning bolt. 8 is a racetrack. Okay. Even though it'd be weird if they made racetracks with intersections like this. Although I guess that could be a bridge or an overpass. Number 8 is a racetrack. Number 9 is a balloon. Do you see a balloon there? Number 9? Number 9 kind of looks like a balloon. Again, I promise you this is going to come in handy. We're just setting the foundation for the system. Number 10 is a place setting. When I say a place setting or plate setting or however you want to call it, it's like a plate and could be a fork here, could be a spoon. This could be a bowl or a plate. But you see the 1 and the 0. So place setting or plate setting for number 10. All right, that's it. Now, let me explain. Before we go on, I just want to double check, just like we did earlier, in the chat box. Type, what is number 6? Do you remember? All right, I see a number of answers coming in. Thank you all for participating. 6 is a cherry. 6 is our cherry. What is number 7? Do you remember 7? Very good, very good. Lightning bolt. How about number 8? Awesome. I see people saying racetrack. Very good. Number 9. Very good. Number 9, balloon. All righty. And number 10. Tell me number 10. Okay, cool. Now, watch this. I could change things up on you, and I could just tell you chair. What number is chair? If I told you chair, do you remember the number? Good, good, good. I see 4s coming through. If I told you a lightning bolt, what is a lightning bolt? What number is that? Ooh, nice. I see people saying 7. How about a swan? Do you remember the swan? What number is that? Good. Now, what's going on here? We're starting to think visually. There's a point to this. Let me explain the point. Here's our baby. It's back. You got them all. Very good. So let's move on and memorize. Well, we got to associate. Now that we have the foundation of the system, you see all the numbers? They've turned into visuals. And by the way, we have more than 10. I'll explain how we go beyond 10. What if you had to memorize 25 things or 37 things? There's a process for it. It's time to associate. Brain rules. Oh, look at that. We have 12 principles. Let's start memorizing it. Here are the 12 principles. Let's talk about it. So number 1 is exercise. How are we going to remember this? I need you to associate right now a visual for exercise that also includes a pencil. So let me give you the visual because just for the sake of time here, I will tell you the visuals and you have to memorize the visuals I give you, okay? And I did this before, so they just kind of came up with the visuals. You'd come up with them on your own if you were doing this by yourself. I want you to imagine that you go to a gym. You sign up for a brand new gym membership. And at this gym, you notice everybody is exercising with pencils. So there's someone doing curls with a pencil. These are not normal pencils. These are very long, big, thick pencils. Another person's doing the bench press with a pencil. And maybe you're wondering, why did I sign up for this strange gym where everybody is exercising with pencils? Okay. Now, I'm purposely giving you some ridiculous imagery. Why? What did we say earlier? We said you're more likely to remember something if it's weird, if it's strange. Let's move on to number 2, survival. We have a swan here for number 2. I want you to imagine a swan that is struggling to survive. And by that, I mean it's struggling to survive because it's drowning. I want you to imagine a swan that is drowning. I know this makes no sense, but just picture this swan does not know how to swim. It's flapping its wings around. It's drowning. You look at this poor swan and you decide you're going to save it. You jump into the water and try to save. Now, this makes no sense, right? Because swans should have a default setting of knowing how to swim, but not this one. So just imagine this ridiculous scenario where there's a swan struggling to survive because it can't swim. By the way, I did this example about a month ago. I was working with a group and someone told me that one person told me survival reminded him of Charles Darwin. Why? Because You ever hear that quote, survival of the fittest? And he told me he imagined Charles Darwin riding a swan around a lake. And this only works if that's what you associate it to. And it also works if you know what Charles Darwin looked like in his older years. He had this massive beard. And this is kind of a funny visual. So you might picture Charles Darwin riding a swan, and that might remind you of survival. What I'm trying to get at here is that if all of us did this, we would all come up with different images because our brains work differently, and that's fine. But for the time being, just because we have a set limit of time, just picture a swan struggling to survive. Wiring. Wiring is chapter number 3. 3 is McDonald's. I want you to imagine you go to McDonald's, and you know how they have like the, French fries, right? Imagine you go to McDonald's and those French fries are covered in wires. Or you could picture Ronald McDonald. You know that clown I showed you earlier? Picture him covered in barbed wire. Or another image is, what if you were, let's say you go to McDonald's, you get one of their like burgers, and inside the burger, when you bite into it, there is a piece of barbed wire in your burger. That would be painful to think about. By the way, that can help too. When you're visually associating, if you can somehow find ways to initiate emotions, like, oh, that would be painful. Emotions help you remember too. Or that would be hilarious. Or that would be disgusting, right? Anything that's disgusting, like a burger with a barbed wire would be disgusting, but it would also be painful. So maybe you don't like McDonald's. I'm not crazy about McDonald's, but you know, McDonald's is a well-known brand. And if I'm trying to remember wiring, I would picture a burger with barbed wire inside of it. Just because I got to remember wiring. Number 4, attention. Okay, number 4, we know that's attention. Imagine you get a chair that helps you pay attention. You see these hands here? Every time you're not paying attention during this webinar, your chair kind of taps you on the shoulder like, hey, or it kind of nudges you like, pay attention. This is a very disturbing chair, by the way. I say that if you're not paying attention in the webinar, because I know when we do these webinars, sometimes people are listening to the webinar, but they're also checking their email. If that's you, pay attention. No, can't control what you do here, but think of this weird chair nudging you to help you pay attention in a webinar, at maybe a meeting that you have to sit through. We move on to number 5, short-term memory. Now, that's the title of the chapter. 5 is our hook, remember? I don't know about you, but hooks kind of remind me of pirates. So I want you to think of pirates, but very short pirates, like this big. I want you to imagine a bunch of really, really short pirates, very tiny, and they're all running around a beach, like on the beach, looking for their buried treasure. Now, there's like 20 of these pirates. They all have shovels, and they're digging for their buried treasure, and they can't find it because they can't remember where they buried it last night. And the reason they can't remember is because they all have short-term memory problems. So all of them have short-term memory problems, and they can't remember where they buried their treasure. They're all really, really tiny. By the way, notice how I'm getting very elaborate with these visuals. Memory researchers have a name for what we're doing right now. They call it elaborative encoding. Elaborative encoding is just coming up with weird visuals. That's all. Thinking of something strange and weird or exaggerated. And when you do that, they call it elaborative encoding. Helps you remember. A lot of research to back this. So short-term memory. We're going to remember a bunch of short pirates looking for their buried treasure on a beach with shovels. And there's about 20 of them. The more detail we add to this story, the more likely we are to remember. Now, let me ask you, can you remember 1? Type in the chat box if you remember chapter 1. 1, you think of the pencil, right? You're like, pencil. What does that remind me of? Obviously, pencil reminds you of exercise. People working out with pencils, right? Like, this is not a pencil, it's a pen. But like, imagine this was a giant pen, people working out. Exercise. How about number 2? When you think about number 2, you think about the swan, don't you? Swan reminds you of, oh yeah, survival. The swan struggling to survive, the swan that was drowning, Charles Darwin on a swan, whatever that image might be. 3 reminds you of what? 3, if you're having trouble with this process, by the way, you just think about 3. What does it look like? Looks like McDonald's to me, right? The M. Oh, and then that reminds you of, like a lot of people are saying here, wiring. How about number 4? Do you remember 4? Awesome. 4 reminds you of attention, that weird chair that's like tapping you on the shoulder or on the head to like, hey, pay attention. Number 5, what about 5? You think of the hook, don't you? Very good. And hook reminds you of what? All right, awesome. Short-term memory. I see a lot of people. Thank you all again for participating. Now let's move on to 6. We're just going to zoom through the rest of these. Number 6 is a cherry. I want you to picture a cherry with we have to remember long-term memory. Long-term memory. I want you to picture a cherry with a ridiculously long stem. Like, cherry might be like this big. And picture a cherry with a ridiculously long stem. Maybe you're eating a bag of cherries and you notice one of them has like, what the heck? Why is this stem so long? Cherry with a long stem to remember long-term memory. Number 7, sleep. 7 is a lightning bolt, right? I want you to imagine you're sleeping like this morning and your alarm goes off. You get a new alarm clock, and this alarm clock has a special feature. You know the snooze button? When you hit the snooze button, I hit snooze, I'm not going to lie, I hit snooze like 2 or 3 times this morning. When you hit the snooze button on this alarm clock, it strikes you with lightning, okay? That's a special feature of this new alarm clock that you get. So that's related to sleep, alarm clock with lightning bolt capabilities. Number 8 is stress. So remember I told you they'd never make racetracks with intersections like this? Imagine they did. Imagine that was an actual intersection and there's a bunch of race cars going around, and every time they get to that intersection, they're worried because they might crash into another car. Now that's very stressful. I want you to imagine the race car drivers are driving and they're stressed out about this intersection. And I want you to imagine, to relieve their stress. Have you ever seen one of those stress balls before? A stress ball? That's where you like squeeze to relieve your stress. Imagine the stress balls are embedded into the steering wheel. Something like this. To relieve the stress of that intersection. Stress. 8. Racetrack. Stress. 9. Sensory integration. Now this one might be a little harder because it's a more vague term, but sensory integration is about your 5 senses. Now your 5 senses all have visuals, right? There's a visual of your hand for your sense of touch, your nose for your sense of smell, and so on. Picture all 5 of these body parts inside of a very, very large balloon. Not a normal balloon, which might be like this. Picture a ridiculously large balloon, and there are 5 body parts floating around in this balloon. This is kind of a disturbing image, the way I'm picturing it, but the more disturbing it is, the better for your memory, okay? Now, if you picture these 5 body parts floating around in the balloon, it's only to remind you of your 5 senses. And your 5 senses, that's to remind you of sensory integration, okay? Sensory integration. All right, let's move on to 10. 10 is vision. And here we have, what is 10? A plate or a bowl. 1 and 0, right? Now, I don't know about you, but the most logical thing to do here, if this was a bowl and we have to memorize vision, well, the most logical and rational thing to do would be to fill this bowl with eyeballs. So picture a bowl filled with eyeballs, but I don't want you to picture this image here. I want you to picture actual eyeballs. What would a bowl filled with eyeballs look like? Like real eyeballs. They'd probably be a little moist, a little bloody, yeah? Optic nerve still attached. Imagine one of them winks at you, like you'd be a little put off by that. Why is this eyeball winking at me? Wait, how does it have eyelids? Okay, so vision, like I said before, the more disturbing, the more graphic you make these images in your head, the more likely you're going to remember them. Now, let me ask you, in the chat box, type out number 6. Do you remember 6? I got a feeling you do. Number 6 reminds you of the cherry. And I see a lot of people typing long-term memory. Why? The cherry had a long stem. Number 7, do you remember number 7? Awesome. Okay, 7 is the lightning bolt, and that reminds you of that alarm clock. When you hit snooze, you get struck by lightning. Number 8. Do you remember number 8? I see a lot of people typing in the chat box. This is actually a lot of fun. When we do this in person, people have a lot of fun with this. So it's cool to see it on the webinar forum too. Number 8 is the racetrack, right? 8 reminds you of stress. How about number 9? And by the way, I see some of you just typing all of them in a row, like 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Awesome. Number 9 is the balloon with the 5 senses, the 5 body parts, sensory integration. The last one we did just now, 10. Remember that? A bowl or a plate? Well, this was a bowl filled with eyeballs. So very, very good. Now, what about 11 and 12? Let me explain how we scale this system up. It's not by doing pencil and pencil or pencil and swan. That's problematic. Why? What if you had to do 21 things? That's why. By the way, I'm just noticing on the time, we're probably going to go about 5 minutes over, just so everyone is aware. But how do we remember 12 and 11? What you do is you got to create a visual rule or a theme that applies to all the numbers between 11 through 20. So, for example, I like to use the theme of snow, but it doesn't have to be snow. It could be rain. It doesn't have to be weather related. Your theme could be cars. It could be celebrities. It could be babies, whatever you want. Let me explain how this works. When you get to 11, you are going to use the visual of a pencil again, but you're also going to use the visual of snow. Why? It's arbitrary. It's arbitrary. You choose whatever your theme is going to be. Let's say, for the sake of this example, let's say the theme you have to remember for everything, 11 through 20, is snow. And that can be any kind of snow-related thing. A snowball or a snowball fight, a blizzard, a snowman. So 11 has to have a pencil, has to have a visual of snow, something related to snow. And it has to have a visual of your topic. We'll get to that. 12, same thing. We're going to use the swan again. Even though we use swan for number 2, survival, we're going to use it again for 12. Because the 12 has a 2 in it. We use snow and we use the topic. So in this case, we have gender and exploration. So all you do is you're taking 11, you're taking pencil, snow, and gender. And you have to remember, okay, I'm going to tell you the visual. Like for gender, I think of a boy and a girl. But be specific with your visuals. So I'm going to picture young children like around, I don't know, the age of 6 or 7 years old. A boy and a girl, maybe they're brother and sister. And I want you to picture them playing in the snow. Maybe they're in the park or in their backyard, and they're fighting with pencils. So not normal pencils. Like pencils are usually around this size. Picture sword-like pencils, and they're fighting with actual, well, not actual swords, but pencils. A boy and a girl fighting with giant pencil-like swords, like a little sword fight. And by the way, they're in the snow. When I say snow, I mean they're knee-deep in the snow. There's a lot of snow. When I say knee-deep, I mean 2 feet of snow. Which, by the way, if you have never been to Chicago, that happens sometimes. Every winter, we'll get 1 or a few snowstorms where it just snows crazy. And sometimes there's a foot or 2 feet, sometimes more, of snow. And it's ridiculous. Somehow this city manages to continue. It doesn't always shut down, but snow plows come out. Picture a boy and girl knee-deep in the snow, just kind of jumping around and fighting with pencils. 12. Okay, 12. Well, 12 is a swan, and we have to remember snow is also involved. Why? Because, again, that was our theme, remember? And then we need to include something related to exploration. This could be whatever you want. Here's how you do it. When I say exploration, you think to yourself, what is the first thing I think of when I think of exploration? Now, to me, it was Christopher Columbus. Okay, it's just embedded in my head. Christopher Columbus, it's part of U.S. history that he landed in the U.S., or they say he discovered the U.S. He was looking for India, but ended up in the U.S. somehow. I I think of Christopher Columbus. Now, exploration doesn't have to remind you of Christopher Columbus. Other things I would think of is exploration also reminds me of Elon Musk and SpaceX and exploring the universe or planet to planet. Exploration also reminds me of Dora the Explorer, this kid's character. I have a 4-year-old daughter, and she likes watching Dora the Explorer. So, I mean, there's various things it could remind you of. But what you're doing here is, okay, you're exploring. I'm going to picture Christopher Columbus. He's sailing into the so-called New World, into the Americas on, they say he came in on 3 ships. I'm going to picture 3 giant swan-shaped ships. So that's what you can do. Oh, and we need snow. So I would picture he's sailing into the new world, quotes, in blizzard-like conditions, even though he landed somewhere in the Caribbean and it's not really snowing over there because we're close to the equator. It's pretty hot. Picture blizzard-like conditions as he's sailing into the New World, or the, again, so-called New World. But you get the idea. I'll bet you could probably remember these. Try later on, see if you could remember all 12. You're going to remember, okay, 4. If I asked you randomly, what is number 4? Type in the chat box. I'll bet some of you can still remember 4, right? What if I did it backwards? What if I told you survival? Do you remember survival? What number is that? Awesome. I see people saying 2. If I told you sleep, what number is that? Okay. How about number 5? Do you remember 5? Notice how I could go backwards and forwards, right? By the way, I don't even have to tell you a number or the title. I could just tell you buried treasure. And what number is that? Or what chapter is that? Buried treasure would remind you of, oh yeah, the pirates and the buried treasure. The more detail we add, then we could link with any one of these things. Now, there is one other thing you could do here. What if you had to remember more than 20 things? Create a new rule. We did snow for 11 through 20. But you don't have to use snow. You could do something else. For 21 through 30, create a new rule. 31 through 40, and so on and so forth. By the way, real quickly, I want to go over one other memory technique that you can use, and it was used by the ancient Greeks. This memory technique is over 2,000 years old, and it's very effective. It's had a resurgence of popularity recently, and it's called the memory palace. I've been teaching this technique for years. And it's kind of cool that people are starting to catch on more recently. They also sometimes call it the method of loci. This has to do with location. So come up with a location you're familiar with. It's best to use your home initially, and then you can add more locations. So what you do, you choose a walkthrough of your home. Now, by the way, this is not my home. This is just a stock image of a home. But number 1, when you come back from work or school, what's the first thing you encounter? Is it your door? Is it the driveway? Is it a parking lot? Is it the lobby of the building? Is it the sidewalk? What I do, I would do something like this. Like, okay, mailbox. First, I check my mail. It's right outside my door, so I just check my mail. Number 2 is the front door. 3 is the stairway. 4 is the living room, hallway, a bathroom, and so on and so forth. But what you do is you associate now. So let's say your topic was technology and your memory palace was your home. The memory palace is just to help you memorize. Let's say these are your first 5 locations. You never use a location twice. And let's say you had to remember these 5 companies in this precise order. I don't know, maybe this is based on market capitalization, or maybe it's based on revenue or employee headcount or some other, I don't know. This is just arbitrary here. So Apple, you got to think of something related to Apple and associate that to the mailbox. I would picture the ghost of Steve Jobs flying out of my mailbox as I open it. Steve Jobs related to Apple, right? Kind of like a genie out of a bottle. Number 2, Amazon. Picture a giant box from Amazon at your front door. 3, Facebook. Or actually, maybe the box is being delivered by Jeff Bezos. I'm not talking about 1998 Jeff Bezos that just sells books. I'm talking about, like, more modern day Jeff Bezos, as you see here, who sells whatever he wants. 3, Facebook. If we're going with like figureheads of companies, I would go with, okay, Mark Zuckerberg, Oh, I got to associate to my stairway. Okay. Mark Zuckerberg, as I enter my home, I picture him on my stairway, and he's just kind of checking his Facebook on my stairway. And I'm outraged because I'm like, Mark Zuckerberg, why have you violated my privacy yet again by breaking into my home? Anyway, so we can go on and on with this. Blue birds for Twitter, flying around the living room, something related to Netflix. You see how this works. Also, you can add details to this technique. How? If you had to remember details, you just add 3 details. You visualize them, and you put them in the hallway or the living room or wherever they happen to be. And you can create multiple memory palaces. If I was a student and I had to memorize things for a history class, maybe I use my home. I got to remember things for physics class, maybe I use my friend's place, my aunt's place, my childhood home, and so on. So this is a great way to memorize information. Also, there's a similar sound technique. I'm just going to go through these pretty quickly because I know we're going over time. This is to memorize vocabulary. Claustrophobia. Now, I know a lot of you already know what this means, but what if we were teaching a kid? The similar sound technique helps you remember through sound. Claustrophobia. Claustrophobia. What does claws remind many little kids of? I don't know, maybe Santa Claus. By the way, claws doesn't have to be associated to Santa Claus. Claws also sounds like the claws of a monster, right? Claws. Claws also sounds like closet. Closet. Well, we have to associate that to the meaning. Santa Claus and fear, the meaning of the word is fear of closed spaces. So, I don't know, picture Santa Claus stuck in a chimney. He's afraid of closed spaces. Or what about this word? You already know what claustrophobia means. What about balloon phobia? Balloon phobia. Any idea what this means? This is the fear of needles. Balloon phobia. Okay, balloon. Balloon. What does that sound like? I don't know about you. Sounds like a balloon to me. Balloon phobia. Picture a balloon afraid of needles coming at it. Balloon phobia. This is not the fear of balloons. It's the fear of needles. Okay, but a balloon is afraid of needles coming at it. Or anthrophobia. Anthrophobia is the fear of people. Anthro, you can get it from the prefix. Anthro as in anthropology, right? Study of people. You could also get ant. Anthrophobia. Fear of people. Picture a bunch of ants afraid of people stepping on them. You could use this with other languages. Barco means boat in Spanish. Barco. Okay, barco. Well, I don't know about you, but I see the sound bar here, or bark. Bark. B-A-R-C. Bark, like a dog barking. Maybe you picture a dog barking for help. It's stranded at sea. This poor little dog is stuck on a boat. And maybe he's like barking for help. Bark. Barco. Now, I might picture this dog, you might picture this dog, but we all come up with different visuals. That's how it is. Kino is a German word. Kino means theater, like a movie theater, a cinema. Well, Kino is very close to rhino. Kino, rhino, similar sound. Kino. Picture a bunch of rhinos. You're at a theater and a bunch of rhinos bust through the screen and start chasing people around the theater. And picture all the violence and death and gore associated with rhinos chasing people around a theater. By the way, I'm Polish, so I'll teach you a Polish word. Dom. Dom just means house, where you live, your home. Dom. Dom sounds like dome in English. Dome. Dome. Okay, picture a house shaped like a dome. Or picture your house, and there's a dome, like a snow globe type dome around your house. So anyway, this is just a different ways of approaching material and trying to remember it. I do want to go real quickly over the things we covered today. And I want you, more importantly, to look at, because we're going to kind of wrap things up and we'll do a Q&A session, or you could also email me, but we talked about how your memory works. We talked about memory influencers. What were those influencers? Well, chunking. Remember that acronym CARVO, C-A-R-V-O. C for chunking, A for association, R for repetition, V for visualization, O for out of the ordinary. Those are all things that influence your memory. Mnemonics can help too. We talked about spaced repetition and retrieval practice, this Fibonacci technique. We talked about when to review, right, based on those Fibonacci numbers. How to remember while you're reading, this iris method, this numeric peg system. Remember, 1 is a pencil, 2 is a swan. You don't have to use those numbers. You could do different numbers, but then you keep it the same. We talked about the memory palace technique and also how to remember vocabulary. What I will do is I will send I'll send some supplemental materials to all of you. You could actually find them if you go to this link right here. But I'll send it to the organizers as a follow-up email, irisreading.com/BC3. If you go to this link, you'll find slides, you'll find handouts for today. But I'll also email them to the organizers, and they can distribute it to everyone here. So all of you you'll have recordings, you'll have slides just for reference material. And as homework, what I would recommend you do is try to create your own memory palace and actually utilize it. Next time you have to remember something, just take something you have to read. Create a memory palace first for your home, walkthrough of your home. And then take something you've read and, okay, chapter 1, maybe they discussed 8 different things. Do it based on sections and try to actually put those in different parts of your home, a visual representation of that topic. So also don't forget about those speed drills. We talked about doing speed drills. I would recommend, if you're looking for an ideal way to follow up today's class, 15 minutes a day for 2 weeks. And the way you do that is through this process. Inspect your material, read your material, time yourself. Maybe you read for 30 minutes. Okay, then you do a speed drill that's 15 minutes. Or maybe you read for 8 minutes. You do a speed drill that's 4 minutes. I would recommend doing 15 minutes a day for the next 2 weeks if you want some unofficial homework. That would be a great way to continue improving your speed. Also, you can go to our website. We have a lot of online courses that cover other topics, how to memorize names. We have actually courses that go into more depth on speed reading. You can check it out on our website. But I want to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. I hope you found it helpful. We've gone through a lot of information here, and I just want to put my contact info here. Feel free to connect on LinkedIn. If you have questions that come up in the future, feel free to shoot me an email, or you can call me as well if you like. But I want to thank everyone that organized this work. Deshaun, thank you so much for inviting me to do this. I apologize that we went over on the time. I was trying to fit a lot of information. We actually covered more than usual in this kind of time frame, but I apologize to everyone if anyone had to leave before that time frame. But thank you again for attending, and enjoy the rest of your week.
No worries. Thanks, Paul. It was all very helpful, and especially visualizing everything in order to remember it, I think is something that we can all take away from this. Very quickly, before we sign off, if we have 1 or 2 questions for Paul, we may be able to answer before we wrap up. Paul, are you seeing any questions that has come to you on your private chat?
Let me take a look real quick. We have one person that asks, is there a special way to remember equations? Ooh, good question. So I'll just bring it up real quickly. What you have to do with equations is you have to come up with visuals for numbers. We already have that, right? Numeric peg system. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and so on. You can also, every equation also has variables, right? A, B, C, could be an X, Y, Z. Think about A. When I think of A, I would replace A, and A would be my apple. B would be something else. C would be, I don't know, maybe a cat, or C kind of looks like Pac-Man if I visualize it. Now, so we have, every equation has numbers, variables, but also operators, right? Like the plus sign or multiplication or division and so on. Parentheses, exponents. So what do we do with those? Again, we're trying to visualize everything. So if I have addition, like a plus sign, well, things are being stacked on top of things when I'm coming up with a visual. If I have a minus sign, like a subtraction sign, well, I would picture something being stolen, like taken away, right? Subtraction. What about multiplication? Things magically multiplying. Division, things being cut in half, like maybe there's a sword involved. And I mean, they might be cut into 3 pieces, 2 pieces, depends on divided by, right? Or with division, we also have numerator, denominator, like the top and the bottom. Well, what would remind you of top and bottom? You might picture top being like the rooftop of a building or of your house. bottom could be the main floor, or bottom could be the basement. You could think of like subway and street level, or somebody might say for numerator and denominator, it might be heaven and hell. Either way, what you're doing is you're trying to basically come up with a story for your equation. So whatever your equation is, it's going to have numbers, it's going to have variables, and it's going to have operators. So while you're trying to memorize that equation, you got to create that story in your head. It'll help you remember better. We also have a question: is there a way to remember names? I will send everyone. Deshaun, if it's okay with you and your team, I'll email. I know I have you and your team's emails. I don't have everyone's emails, but I do know all of you at the CFA Society have those emails. I'll send you an email that you can pass along, and it will include a link to a PDF that I created on how to remember names. I'll send that later this morning or evening your time, and I would imagine you'll pass that along to all the attendees or registrants. But yeah, thank you all so much. There's also, can you teach how to focus on one thing at a time? I see this question coming into me. Yeah, this is something very important. Maybe we'll do a future workshop. We have done workshops on how to improve focus, but I see a question here. Can you teach how to focus on one thing at a time? That reminds me of like multitasking, and there are dangers to multitasking. When I say that, I mean working on too many things at once doesn't really help you. Usually it's better if you focus on one thing at a time. And I would imagine the person that asked this question probably has that in mind. You can be more productive when you focus on one thing at a time. It's kind of a topic for another webinar. We've done those before. I just don't want to stray away. We have online courses you can check out on our website if you want to go more into that. That would be specifically we have a personal productivity webinar. Not webinar, but it's actually an online course, and you can check that out. But again, Deshaun, thank you. I see those were the questions I got. I don't see any others, but if anybody has questions in the future, feel free to send me an email.
Great. Thanks, Paul. On behalf of CFA Sri Lanka Society, thank you very much for running these programs for us over the last 3 days. And thank you everyone for joining. As Paul said, we will be sharing these webinars have been recorded, and we'll be sharing these recordings in the next week or so once they've gone through a bit of editing. And we will share across all the material that Paul shares with us also with you once we receive it. Paul's contact details are on the screen right now, so if you do have any follow-up questions, please free to reach out to him as well. So thanks everyone for joining, and good evening.
Thank you. Bye.